All right, so we're back, and this time we're getting into the real meat of the game, which is Dwarf Fortress and getting started with your fortress. So first it has to load the world, obviously. And then every time you start a new game, or rather when you finish a game, more or less, the history will advance by a couple of weeks. And this is a relatively new feature, which is pretty cool. But again, it's another thing where, excuse me, the bigger your world is, the older it is, the longer this starts to take. But this was added fairly recently, and before then, the history was kind of like, the world was kind of static once history generation was finished. But now history kind of keeps happening, which is cool. And it's weird to call it history, but that's just kind of how it ended up being. So, all right, immediately bombarded with information. The local is, okay, let me start here. There is in the middle and right windows a little flashing yellow X, and that is your cursor. And then the window that says local, that is the region which is under the cursor. So it's sort of like zoom levels. On the left, you're zoomed in all the way, and then region and world. And it gets simplified the farther out you go. So it looks like we have 3 oceans, and this world's pretty decent because it's got a lot of mountain ranges. And then you'll see on the right, it gives you some information where it is, temperature, vegetation, trees, stuff like that. Surroundings will generally tell you how dangerous it is. And then below that, one of the more important things is it says some soil, deep metals, flexstone layer. And that is talking about what's actually in the ground. So obviously there's a layer of soil. There are multiple metals that are not near the bottom, but a little higher up, which is good because there can be deep metal or deep metals. Oh, I'm sorry, deep is at the bottom rather than closer to the top. Then it would just say metals or something else. And flexstone can also be important because certain metals are made from one kind of metal and then a flexstone, but I won't get into that right now. But basically, flexstone is good. So let's look around at a site and see if I can point out some of the things you want to avoid. Okay, here we go. So this site has shallow clay, so it has a layer of clay, and then it has many layers of soil, very deep soil. But the thing that I want to point out is the aquifer. And what aquifer means is that there's a layer that is basically filled with water. So if you dig into it, it immediately fills with water. And dwarves cannot swim normally. That's a skill they have to learn. So it's very dangerous unless you know how to deal with it. And they're not that hard to deal with, but that's just one thing I would avoid if you're new. But what I'm going to do, actually, is there's a bunch of hotkeys at the bottom, and I'm going to press F to find desired location. And the X and Y dimensions are over in the local screen. That's how many tiles it's going to search in. And then you can tell it whether you do or don't want any of these things, or what you want if they have them. So I'm going to skip most of this stuff, but I'm going to say I want flexstone, I do not want aquifer, I want a river, and I want multiple metals and soil. I should probably want soil. Now we'll just leave that so we can look at a few more. Then you hit enter, and it's going to go down and check every 4x4 region to see if it can find all of those things. And you'll see on the world window, there's flashing a bunch of red X's, and then occasionally there's a green X. And the red X's means there's nothing there. Green X's means that there are sites that match that. So I'll go ahead and skip to when this is done. All right, so our search has completed. And all of this stuff I've been saying is basically oriented at a beginner or someone who is pretty new to the game. Any site that has wood and fresh water and isn't so cold that the water will freeze is basically going to be fairly doable, more or less, as long as it doesn't have some sort of terrifying or horrible surroundings. Like those purple mountains up in the upper right corner. If we go up there, you can hold shift to make the cursor go faster. It'll say that the surroundings are terrifying. And in terrifying, surroundings. You can have undead, poisonous clouds, horrible kinds of rain. It's typically harder to deal with. Of course, the flip side to that is if we go down to these yellow mountains, these are joyous wilds, and those will have less dangerous things in them generally. But like I said, anywhere that has wood, water, no aquifer, and doesn't get too cold, you'll be fine. So if it's hot, warm, temperate, I'm not sure if temperate freezes, but anyway. For an easy one, let's look over by these Joyous Wilds mountains. Mirthful is also safe. So you can use U, H, K, and M to move the box on the local map around, and it will show you whatever is in the center of the box. But you can also press the function keys to look at specifically what biome it's talking about. So here, the flashing green X's in the local screen have little soil, shallow metals, deep metals, and flexstone layer. What's listed on the right. If I keep going to here, it swaps over to what's up in the mountains, shallow metal, deep metal, flexstone layer. So this looks like a pretty good spot. We've got, looking at the local screen, you've got some mountains or hills and a river, and that's pretty good. Generally, I like to have the river in the middle because the safest way to have your water is connected to your fortress directly, so the easiest way to accomplish that is just to build directly on top of it. You can also, if you hold shift and push those same keys used to move around the local screen, U, M, K, H, you can resize it so you can make it bigger. Again, this is one of those things where as a CPU intensive game, the bigger you make it, the worse it's going to run in the long run. And so we'll go ahead and actually I want somewhere with soil because that's going to be the easiest. So let's see here. Okay, this looks pretty good. If it has soil, yes it does. That other site might have had soil and I was just looking at it wrong, but whatever. So let's look at the biomes again. Over here we have multiple shallow metals and multiple deep metals. That's very good. Okay, they both have metals. And since they're in different biomes, we can end up having different kinds of metal too. So including multiple biomes in your embark area can be good and bad. Excuse me. All right. So the next few things I'm going to talk about here are not necessary at all. You could just embark here if you wanted to. But if you hit tab, you can look at who your neighbors are. So we just have dwarves, which is good because that means we'll basically only get dwarven caravans. And that's also bad because you don't get the human and elf caravans, but it's also safer. And you can also, here on this screen, you can push plus and minus to pick which civilization you come from. And you can see on the world window, there's little blue omega symbols, and that shows where they have land or forts or whatever. So it looks like, and it doesn't matter, honestly, this doesn't really affect anything. They'll still send you a trade caravan at the same time and all that, but I'm going to go ahead and choose this one, the Armor of Glazing, because it's closest. And then you also have elevation, which changes the local screen to show how high or low it is, and it looks pretty flat, which is pretty manageable. That's good. That'll be less confusing. This is another height map thing. If you see really high numbers next to really low numbers, it's, So anyway, we will press E to embark. Now you could play now, and that would be fine. You can always... the hardest part of Dwarf Fortress is when you only have your starting 7 dwarves, usually. It's pretty hard to put yourself in a really, really bad situation just starting right off. But we're going to go ahead and prepare carefully anyway. Just to go over what kind of things I like to take and why not you might want to take them. Alright, so on our left, we got our dwarves. I'm not going to read all their names because that would take forever. And then on the right, we have skills. So on the left, we have highlighted Zuglar, blah, 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 blah. And on the right, these are his skills. And he knows nothing right now. And this is going to be the same for all 5 of them. And the little blue 10s is how many upgrades of skills we're allowed to give them. Then if we push tab, that'll go over to the item screen, and this is all on the left in brackets are the items that we're taking. And then to the right of that, the column of numbers, that's how many points they cost. And we have points down in the lower right, and items cost points, and also upgrading a skill cost points, which is on the far right, the column of numbers that are all 5s. That's how many it takes to get it to the next level. So when you add one with plus or minus, it goes to 6 points, 7 points, 8 points, etc. So we'll go ahead and I'll kind of do the kind of general setup I usually go with. So miners are really useful early on because unless you're doing something weird, you're probably going to be making most of the space for your fortress underground. So most people will take anywhere from 1 to 3. I like 2 generally. And this doesn't have to be very high because mining is a skill you learn fairly quickly. Basically, the skills you want to look at for taking for your embark doors are ones that either are hard to train or are useful immediately. And mining is the latter. So we'll go ahead and make him an adequate miner, him an adequate miner. Or she could be she. Let's look at, if we push V with Zuglar highlighted, this wall of text is a big old description of Zuglar. And his last name means martyr pages. He is a he. He's 60 years old. He was born, blah, blah, blah. You could look at all this stuff. There are a couple of things that are relevant here. When the text turns green, it says he's incredibly tough and mighty. That is actually describing a mechanic characteristic of this dwarf. And so is below that in the next, that's that same darker green. It says he has willpower and a good memory. That is also describing something mechanic. But the top one, the top green line that says he is incredibly tough and mighty, generally is describing their physicality, and that does make a difference if they're soldiers. But I'm not going to worry about that right now because while you could go through and look for the best soldiers and blah, 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 it doesn't really matter. Any dwarf can basically do anything. At that point, you're just min-maxing, and it's unnecessary. Depending on who you ask, I guess. You never know. So, we've got a miner. Another couple things that are immediately useful are carpenters and masons. And carpenters make things out of wood, masons make things out of stone. Pretty straightforward. Miners, when they mine, they create stones as they clear stuff out. Masons can use those stones to make things. And so where you want to put these things on what dwarfs, if I make this guy a mason, which I think I will, if he's making something as a mason, he's not going to be mining. So you want to be careful not to give a dwarf too many time-consuming things that they won't get to them all. But generally, you're not always mining, and you are often masoning. So you might even consider taking more than one mason. Then I guess I'll make him a carpenter. And this will mean, because I'm doing it this way, that I'm not going to be able to make things and mine at the same time, usually. But that's fine for now. We'll make this guy a woodcutter, so he will chop down trees and create wood for the carpenters to use. And then additionally, I think because woodcutting is something you don't do super often, we'll also make him our farmer. So the farming skill is grower, and both of these are also ones that are just useful early. They're not that hard to train. And growing is the farming skill. They create farms, they plant seeds. Any dwarf who sees a plant that is fully grown in a farm can go and harvest it, but only growers can plant them. And take care of the fields. There's some other things you can do. All right, and then I think we'll go to the next guy. So getting into some things that are hard to train, weaponsmith, armorsmith, metalsmith, and metal crafter are all hard to train skills because to get better at those skills, the dwarf has to make those things out of metal, and metal is can be more or less common, but typically the really good metals are either harder to make or rarer. So bringing a dwarf that is good at making those things from the get-go can be useful because you don't have to spend time or resources making them better at them, because you want to have high-quality weapons and armor, obviously, because that does make a difference on how they function. Personally, I usually don't take weapon, armor smith, or metalsmith just because, or metal crafter, just because generally you're not making stuff out of metal very early, and once you get some more dwarves at your fortress, usually one of them will have one of those related skills. On the other hand, gem cutters and setters, which is a similar deal that takes some time to train up, and it used to be that you could only use gems, but now you can also cut rocks, so they're not as hard to train, but it's still something that you might want to consider. So I'll go ahead and do that. And because that's something I do very seldomly, I think we will also make this guy a noble, basically. You want to have someone who, if you give someone leader or many of the interaction skills, so like conversationalist, comedian, flatterer, consular, pacifier, they tend to become popular, and the popular dwarves are the ones that become your mayors and your nobles usually. Well, just mayor, that's the only one they pick early on. But so if you want a certain dwarf to be that, you can influence that from here. I think we just want him to be a what is the one I'm looking for? I think, right, it's appraiser. There we go. And appraisers can find the worth of items when they're training, and if you don't have an appraiser and you're trying to trade with someone who's brought you a trade caravan, you have no idea what their things or your things are worth, and so it becomes a lot harder to deal with that. So we'll go ahead and do that. And then we'll also make him a leader, so maybe he can become the mayor someday. Zuglar Uzelnam. The second Zuglar. Okay, and all right, so we've got a lot of basic stuff down. Generally, another one of the things that is more difficult to train is soldier skills. And so one of the things that I like to do is make someone who's okay at being a soldier, but they're very good at teaching and learning, because if you put them in your military, they will then make it so your other dwarves can generally learn a lot faster. At least in my experience. I'm not sure how accurate that actually is, but armor, fighter, and then a weapon. We'll say axe. There are some differences with the weapons, but you can kill anything by hitting it with a weapon enough generally. So let's see what else. Dodger. All right, and then we'll pick a couple of these to raise up. Defensive ones, we'll say. So he'll be my soldier, and because he's a soldier, I'm going to go ahead and push C to customize, and then I'm going to give him a custom profession name and make it soldier so that I can remember who I made my soldier. Another guy that I usually like to take because it's really hard to train is a doctor, and you can only get it to adequate on everything. So these ones, wound dresser, diagnostician, surgeon, bone doctor, and suturer are all doctor skills, and diagnostician is very important because if you have a bad diagnostician, they will diagnose things that your dwarf does not have, and then they will get treatments for things that they do not have. That is very bad. And you want a doctor because there's not modern medicine in Dwarf Fortress, and people will die of infections. And, you know, all that sort of thing. So, again, with this guy, I'm going to give him a custom profession doctor because it's easier that way. All right, so we got your basics down. This is like, let me get back to the top here. Basically, having a miner, woodcutter, carpenter, mason, farmer is pretty decent to just get out the door, and then everything else is just butter, basically. You know, like things you want to have, things you need to have. Another good one, actually, I'll make one of these guys. Not the grower. I'll have one of the miners, I guess. Not the carpenter. The carpenter is going to be getting used more. All right, we'll make him a bone carver and a stone crafter, because those two kinds of crafts are a easy early way to generate value, which you can then trade for things you want or need. We'll throw this guy a building designer, just because some buildings require a building designer. They just have to have the skill. So it's easy enough to just do this later, but might as well, so I don't have to deal with it. Let's see here. Our herbalist. Yes, we want a cook and brewer, definitely. Brewers are more important than cooks, which may be a little unintuitive, but the reason for that is many foods you can eat raw and the dwarves don't really care. They like it more if it's prepared in a nice way, but they'll just eat vegetables or whatever that's laying around. They can't eat things like raw meat generally unless they're desperate, but food they can just eat whatever. But if dwarves don't have alcohol, they actually slow down if they don't have alcohol too long, and they won't die or get injured, but if they're forced to only drink water, they will actually do everything slower. So, it's not the end of the world, but you want to have alcohol for your dwarves because they become very sad if you don't. And let's see. Fisher is also a decent choice, but generally those show up soon enough. As long as you have some other way to get food. Fish is one of the ways you can have food, so I wouldn't recommend not bringing a farmer, but you could theoretically get by on fish or something. An animal trainer, that's one that is good to bring with you because it's hard to train. You could bring another soldier so that you can have two to start with and they can spar with each other and teach each other quickly. Giving them different skills, like I gave that guy dodge and fighter. You could give him like striking and some other weapon. We definitely want a mechanic because they can make mechanisms, and mechanisms are useful. Where are you, mechanic? One of the things that I think makes Dwarf Fortress so impenetrable seeming is just that the UI is very unique and also poorly organized in some ways. Like, this list is not alphabetized, so I can find things because I've basically memorized it. I've played this game so long, but like right now I'm having trouble finding mechanic for whatever reason. I'm sure someone else has already spotted it, but there it is. Stuff like that will happen. And it's gotten better, believe it or not, but, You can also have hunters if you give somebody crossbowmen and... what's the hunting skill? What's the hunting skill? I don't think it's hunting. I think it might be ambushing, actually. They can hunt animals if you have any, which is nice. I think we'll leave it at that. I don't want to bring too many things because if I really wanted to, I could just leave all of these guys with no skills at all and leave them peasants and get a similar effect, because you can change what jobs that they will and won't do once you're in the game, which is why I said it's hard to put yourself in a position where you're just really out of luck, because you can always just tell a dwarf to like pick something up if you forget something. Just say, I didn't bring one of these, so you can be that. I suppose I should bring an organizer so that I can do that. Let's see, maybe have a guy who can read. I'm just doing that for fun. You don't need to have someone who can read. So we'll go with that for now, and that's pretty light. You could min-max this a lot more, but that's like just kind of a basic setup that I might use. Like, for instance, no, I'm not going to get into that. I'll say that for later. All right, so over to items. Also on the right, we have animals, and animals are worth a lot of points because they have a lot of uses, but generally it takes a long time to farm them. And most of the expensive animals are good for being farmed. So we'll do that after I get the other items here. So we do want 2 picks. Picks are what dwarves use to mine. We don't need 2 battle axes. The reason they have 2 is because one of them is going to be those. I'm sorry. I had a brain fart. The battle axes are for chopping down trees. And I actually do want 2 because I want one for my carpenter and one for my soldier. Anvil is super, super important because you need an anvil to make things out of metal. And to make an anvil, you have to have an anvil. So if you don't bring an anvil, you have to wait for a trader to come and have one. So that is definitely something you want to have, even though it's a little expensive. We've got booze. Booze is good. Seeds. Plump helmet, pigtail, cave wheat, sweet pod. Plump helmet is amazing, especially if you're a new player. It grows in every season. It grows a lot. You can make food out of it. You can make booze out of it. It's just a wonderful plant, to the point where it's, I would say if you're a more experienced player, like one of the ways you might want to make the game more challenging is actually just not use plump helmets, but we'll keep those. Pigtail is not used for eating. You can brew alcohol out of it, I believe, but you don't want to because you make thread out of it. Cave wheat is for brewing and cooking. You can't eat it raw, though, I don't believe. Sweet pod is for cooking, and you can also make sugar out of it. Rock nuts grow into quarry bushes, which is confusing because there are no rock nuts when you're looking at farms to plant, but there are quarry bushes. So just, I'm sure I'll say that again when we get to it, but rock nuts grow to quarry bushes. And you can use those to make oil, which you can make soap out of. Dimple cups. I think those are used for a dye. Chopped Journeyman liver, that's some sort of animal liver. That's food. Plump helmets, cloth thread bags, ropes. The default is fine because bags are useful and it takes a while to be able to make them. Quivers, I do not need any quivers because I don't have a hunter. Buckets, splints, and crutches, I'm going to go down to 1 of each because you can make those out of wood. Same with wheelbarrow and step ladder. Actually, I'll leave the wheelbarrow, but we'll make a step ladder later if we want to use those. So I'm going to hit N for new, and this will bring up the list of items that you can get. And I want more booze because every, I forget the actual number, but every 12 boozes or so, you get a couple free barrels out of it. So I want free barrels. And dwarves have booze preferences, which doesn't actually matter immediately, but happier dwarves are better, are safer, because one of the ways that fortresses, one of the more common ways that fortresses end up destroying themselves is you get a really unhappy dwarf who then makes another dwarf really unhappy, who then makes another dwarf really unhappy, etc., etc. So it's a consideration more so than you might think. Okay, so yaks have a lot of meat. You can milk them. Dogs you can train. They can be used for war or hunting. They can also be pets. Cats will hunt vermin. Also can be pets, which is a good and a bad thing because dwarves like having pets, but if their pet dies, it makes them sad, obviously. So it can kind of go both ways. Horses, I'm not sure why you would want horses specifically, because I think they're just good for meat. I don't know. I don't think you can milk horses anyway. Sheep, which is the ewe and the ram, you can shear those for thread, which is nice. I think you can also make, you can also get milk from them and eat them, obviously, etc., etc. One thing that is good to consider is turkeys, because they are very cheap, and of the poultry you can get, they are the most efficient in terms of bone and meat for farming. So you want hens and gobblers. I'll just get 3, get 2 hens, 1 gobbler, because they're so cheap, and I can show you how to do that. Also, sometimes I'll get peacocks and peahens, just because that's more fun to have those running around. Let's see, let's get some dogs as well. Might as well. I like... Dogs can be fairly useful. And take cats at your own risk. They tend to breed themselves out of control, which isn't necessarily a hard thing to fix, but they can do that. So we'll just take 2 cats. You know, what could happen? 2 cats, I say. Let's see. It doesn't look like I can afford another pair of animals, and I'm getting them all in male-female groupings because obviously I want to farm them. I want them to breed and make more, so that if I want to butcher them, I don't make them all go away. And that does take a long time. If you get like cows or horses or yaks or whatever, it'll take a while for them to breed and then have more and then be able to create a sustainable cycle. So they're not good for immediate or very replaceable food. All right, so we have 82 points left over. That's a lot. So let's add a set of equipment for our soldier. That sounds like a good idea. So we'll just get cheap stuff, because it's even the cheapest materials tend to be kind of expensive. Okay, I'll get a breastplate. We want the 2 most important things are the torso and the head covering. So we'll get a breastplate and a cap. Yes. And a shield, why not? And there's all sorts of things you can take with you. Most of this stuff you can make either by the time it's relevant or early enough that I don't think it's super important. Shields, copper bucklers. Ropes and bags and cloth in general. It takes a little while to get thread industry going, so those can be useful things to bring extra of. More seeds are useful. I might take more rock nuts just because they tend to get used up fairly quickly. What else? More booze is always a good idea. Alright, so that's pretty good. So we could just start right now, but I'm going to do the fun thing, and I'm going to name the fort and the group and all that good stuff. So let's do fort first. And you can set this yourself, but I think it's more fun to just hit random a few times and see what you got. Cut arrows. Great. The fort of cut arrows, and our group is... the deep whip is not bad, but let's hit random a few times. The greatest channel. You heard it here first. Okay. And the symbol for the... What is this? Okay, so this is the symbol for the greatest channel. And you can customize this yourself. I don't think there's a random option for this, so I'll just make something real quick and cut to that. Alright, so just real quick, I made an image of a dwarf and he's surrounded by 5 coins. We'll just use that for the greatest channel. And we'll hit Y for done. And that is it for embarking. So I will go ahead and... Oh, and also before I forget, you can hit S and it'll save your setup, basically. That doesn't tend to always be useful because depending on where you are and what your civilization is, what you can actually get for your embark can change, but that's there if you want to use it. So we'll go ahead and hit E and embark. I have 1 unspent point. Oh no, I could get a seed, but I don't care. So we'll go ahead and hit I am ready. And next time we will start on the actual fort.